formally thank you, Marcel, and welcome you to this particularly good podcast that we're doing, and also around the connection between the brain and the body that we're going to discuss for the next 30 minutes.
For sure. Perfect.
And I have a few questions that I have in mind, and I want to get them all out for you one by one. And one of the first things is, we all know that the body and mind are interconnected. I mean, that's a very well-known statement that we all say. But what I'm curious about it is, what is it about the body and the brain that are still blind spots for leaders?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in a way, we almost, if we're going to blame somebody, we almost want to blame, kind of Western science for a lot of our misunderstanding. The dichotomy, as we call it, between brain and body is, historically, we've always treated those two entities as two different things. And and so going far, hundreds of years in terms of medical training and all of that kind of stuff, even religion and spirituality, the mind has been in the realm of the brain, and that and that exoskeleton that sits on top of our heads, and then there's the body, which is the realm of medicine and all of that kind of stuff, and of course over the last couple of hundred years a lot of that's changed, but it's what's interesting is there is still this maybe a misunderstanding, right? That the brain and the body are kind of these two separate entities, and that and that we really don't have to pay attention to the body in order for us to be able to focus on psychology, for example, right? And so when we look at leadership and we look at kind of those type of aspects, a lot of that is really kind of approached from the shoulders up. I mean, even my master's degree is in neuroscience and leadership, and I remember, when I was studying neuroscience, that understandably so, a lot of the neuroscience that we were studying was from the shoulders up, right? And there was very little body integration even in that space, and having that understanding of how the body affects how we process our emotions, or how even the position of our body can change with the type of emotions that we feel, or anything like that. And of course we know for a long time now, we know that in leadership, having an understanding of what we think and what we feel and what we do, are very important components of being I'd say an effective leader. But then there's not so much that understanding of how the body can influence how we think and what we feel and what we do. And it's only really been the last couple of years that that integration is starting to become more mainstream. 15 years ago, it was very difficult to start a conversation in any organization about the bodies of their leaders. Because a lot of it was about how are they behaving, how are they communicating, what kind of strategies, what is their decision making, and all of those kind of things, rather than just kind of saying, hey, what about the whole person, right? This whole human being that is there in body and mind. And if the body is influencing the mind, then potentially the mind is also influencing the body. And if we want a sustainable, not just sustainable leaders from a kind of from a durability standpoint, but if we also want a sustainable organization, then it's going to be important that we do integrate some of that understanding of how important it is to keep ourselves healthy and maintaining those levels of vitality, and also how important that is for the organization to ensure that becomes part of that organizational development model, not part of a wellness model. And that was actually what drove me to write my first book, which was Headstrong Performance, and for large reasons, because even in like HR practices and all of these kind of things, there's still that concept of the realm of the body belongs to the individual, and that should be part of a wellness program, which you kind of do on the side, where you do when you have time left over, or companies invest in it if they have budgets for it, right? But at the end of the day, there's still not really that integration of saying, hey, our human beings that work in our organization are whole people in body and mind. And their bodies are just as important for performance as their minds are. And that whole integration still hasn't really happened in a lot of organizations. And that's still a conversation that really does need to happen at a much deeper level.
Correct, correct, correct. Because I've often seen that people are aware that, hey, I need to improve my strength, I need to improve my flexibility, balance, breathing, whatever, right? And therefore the cognitive agility multiplies. But still, I don't see people or leaders looking at all of it in a very holistic way. Either they are completely into endurance by practicing to do a marathon, which of course is not so often these days. But so there is one dimension that gets more, more attention to, and people are missing out on other things. So, what's your advice for leaders there, Marcel?
Fantastic question. And actually, one of the assessments that I developed when I was writing my thesis was kind of, what I was researching back in those days was actually the relationship between a leader's fitness level and their brain function and their brain capacity, as I call it, their capacity to make decisions, speed of processing, and all of these kind of things. And what's interesting about the research, and it's only really just starting to emerge, but even if you look at a lot of the research done on brain function and exercise has really been done in the cardiovascular space. And that's not because cardiovascular exercise is the only form of exercise that builds brain function, right. But it's because it provides the quickest results. And so when universities and these kind of places are actually doing research, they want to have kind of these quick processes where they can kind of write their papers and do all of these kind of things. So it's much more tempting for the scientific world to actually focus on things like cardiovascular exercise and stuff like that. Now, slowly but surely, there are some other research studies that are coming up where we're looking at other forms of exercise and brain function, and that I find really fascinating, because one of my theories, even back in the day, and you're talking 10, 11 years ago, I actually developed a kind of a training and exercise programming for brain function. And what I even noticed back then in those preliminary days was that different forms of exercise target different areas in the brain. They target different executive functions. Wow. So it's not just a matter of saying, hey, listen, I'm gonna run, let's say I'm gonna do long distance running because that's gonna oxygenate my brain for the most part. Yes, that's true, but there are parts of the brain that really need flexing, just like the muscles. Just when you go into the gym, for example, you don't only train your biceps and then think that you're going to kind of have an overall great looking physique, right? So hopefully anyway, and the same thing counts in the brain. We have to be aware of, kind of say, hey, what aspects of the brain do we really want to be triggering, and what forms of exercise do we want to do? And so for example, if we want to, there's an area in the brain, it's called the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Yes. And that part of the brain is responsible for impulse inhibition. And basically that means that if you're a leader and you have a tendency to be a little bit impulsive, maybe even wear your emotions on your sleeve, having a bit of an impulse inhibition muscle that becomes a little bit stronger, it can be really important, because that's that component of the brain that stops you from losing your temper. It stops you from making emotional decisions too quickly or anything, allows you to reflect a little bit more, gives a little bit more patience and all of those kind of things. That part of the brain is trained for the most part through strength training. So when we do resistance training, especially heavy resistance training, those neurons get fired up way more than, for example, regular cardiovascular exercise, especially the cardiovascular exercise that's comfortable. If a person did cardiovascular exercise, but they did kind of that high intensity sprint training, what they call HIIT training, that would probably trigger it as well, but much more so in kind of in strength training and all of that kind of stuff. The same thing counts with the emotional centers in the brain. The emotional centers in the brain also respond differently to exercise, right? So for example, understanding that emotional processing, if you think about it, 85% of the word emotion is dedicated to movement, right? Emotion. So there's an understanding that if I move my body, it's going to trigger certain type of emotional processes. Right. And so there are certain ways of exercising that trigger certain emotional ways, or ways that we process our emotions in different ways. And so so that would be more, you can think more of like the yogas and the Tai Chis and all of these kind of things, which really plays a lot in that emotional regulation and kind of that holistic kind of self-awareness space, mindfulness, and all of those kind of things. So there are all of these different forms of exercises that I believe in the future are really going to, kind of be identified as, hey, if you want this specific form of brain function, that form of exercise is best for you. And I find that really, really exciting. I think that's going to be an interesting space that we go into, rather than just kind of doing the same thing over and over again and thinking that there's this one size fits all for that whole brain. That's just doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Correct. This is very interesting, Marcel, and I want to understand how, can yoga, because we say yoga is the one thing where you lift your own body weight so that you, and you're not really going to a gym and lifting other forms of weight. So do you think yoga covers all the dimensions that can improve the brain, or do we still need to consider other forms?
That's a tough one, and it really depends on the type of yoga. So whether you're doing hatha, ashtanga, or any of these other forms of kundalini, any way of these forms of yoga will probably trigger the brain in different ways, because they work at different intensities.
Right.
One is faster, one is more intense, one is more powerful, the other one is slower and stuff like that. So I would probably, and on top of that, they've been practicing yoga and Ayurvedic medicine for the past 5,000 years, right? So clearly there's going to be some form of kind of holistic way that yoga can be prescribed for certain mental functions. And if you think about it, and I wrote this in my new book, right, The 5 Energies of Horrible Bosses, is that when we're looking at Ayurvedic medicine, yoga didn't exist, right, until kind of 200 years ago, when actually it was the British that didn't like the ideas of people from India practicing Ayurvedic medicine, because they weren't part of the Western medical training. And so a lot of these Ayurvedic practitioners had to separate out and then create kind of this yoga idea of, because that was physical exercise and that was then tolerated. But if we look at Ayurvedic medicine, which is one of the oldest forms of medicine in the world, yoga was kind of like one of the medicines that was prescribed, one of the treatments that was prescribed, together with other form of dietary and things and all of that kind of stuff. So it probably is one of the most holistic approaches. And I wouldn't be surprised if somebody did research on the various different forms of yoga, that they'd probably also be triggering different parts of the brain. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Marcel, there's an interesting statement which we all say quite often. We say we know it, but we don't do it. And also they say that the greatest gap in human advancement is this awareness and action gap, right? So when it comes to the awareness of the body and the brain, what have you observed to be motivators for people and leaders to take action? Like, for example, we know exercise is important, but that's the biggest trade out in the day when we have a busy day.
Yeah, no, that's a really good, and I actually I dedicated 3 chapters to that in my book, Headstrong Performance, and that all boils down to kind of the integrated model of change, right? So it's of course known as the trans-theoretical model of change. Is really our understanding that we go through psychologically, we go through these different stages of readiness until we're actually able to take action. And when I was studying the trans-theoretical model of change, I also came to understanding that there were actually a couple of other models as well. So I integrated all of those together to create an integrated model of change. And basically what it comes down to is that we're all in a different state of readiness. And so, if I'm not thinking at all about exercise, I'm in the state, what we call pre-contemplation. So I'm just, I'm not even thinking about it. And there are a lot of people in this planet in a state of pre-contemplation where it comes down to that body and that mind awareness. The next stage up is when we do become aware, right? Then we start contemplating, we start thinking about it. And that's the second stage. The third stage then is when we start thinking about doing something, right? We start creating a plan for ourselves. We kind of, you know, preparing ourselves for, hey, maybe I do need to start doing so. Maybe I'll do something 1st of January, right? You know, kind of like one of those things. But we start thinking about doing that. And then the final one is then the action that we then end up taking, and because that's then with that point when we might be ready. And we have to go through those phases. And then of course there's one that comes after that, which is a maintenance and a relapse phase.
Right.
You know, that because every now and then we fall off the wagon, and then we relapse, and we have to go, we go back a few steps, and to me, and I think that's one thing that I learned as a coach is we very often have an expectation that everybody is in the state of readiness and action, but in reality, so many people aren't. And I've just learned to respect where a person is on that on their stages of change. And if they wanted to move from one stage to another, that's great. There are great coaching techniques for that. But you know, but if they're not ready, they're not ready, and that's okay too.
Correct. That's a beautiful way of putting it, because that readiness is often assumed. And
exactly.
Yeah,
absolutely. And especially, you know, because I come from the you know, fitness industry originally, right? So, you know, 30 years ago, I was a personal trainer, and in the fitness industry, it's a very prescriptive way of coaching, and where, you know, it's kind of an expectation that you're supposed to apply yourself in a certain way. And you know, over the past 10 or 11 years, I have another company that actually certifies and trains personal trainers in the understanding of how to coach people through behavior change. And that's always been a very difficult thing for personal trainers to understand, is that they can't tell people what to do because people have a tendency not to apply themselves. And it's those trainers out there who do understand that behavior change and work with the client in that space where they have the tendency to have the greatest success as well.
Wonderful. Interesting, Marcel. I heard in one of the forums that you were presenting, I heard you say that, or rather you quipped there, saying that the brain is connected to the feet and not to the butt. In the virtual world, how should leaders counterbalance the ills of sitting for such long hours?
That's great. And if you noticed, of course, if you're listening to the podcast, you won't. But I'm actually standing right now in the.
I can see that. I can see that.
Yeah. And so that in itself is one of the most important things. And the reason is because a lot of the neurons that you know, kind of are from our brain, you know, what they call them axons. So like kind of these neural bundles, they travel all the way down the body through our spine, and they end up all the way at the bottoms of our feet. And so the brain is very much triggered by the soles of our feet. That's why things like reflexology and all of that kind of stuff is so powerful, because, you know, there are these direct connections between our feet and the brain. Unfortunately, we don't have those same connections in the buttocks. And so when we're sitting, we actually switch the brain off a little bit versus when we're standing. And that's been scientifically proven as well, is that the brain has a tendency to just, you know, kind of be more active and be more alert when we're on our feet rather than we're in a sitting position. So my advice would be sit less.
Correct. COVID has actually forced everybody to innovate, and a lot of companies have to innovate even to sustain, right? And innovation requires a lot of intellectual agility. And what is it about neuroplasticity that is underappreciated by leaders in this context, Marcel, from your experience?
Well, I mean, you know, so for the viewers, you know, neuroplasticity is, of course, is the agility of the neurons in the brain to be able to fire in different sequences and be able to apply themselves in different ways. And one of the challenges, and I'm going to kind of flip that on the other hand, is kind of what I like to call default neural pathways. And these are default neural pathways come from habitual behaviors that we do over the many decades in our lives, and these create behavioral patterns that, you know, what I like to refer to as our operating system, you know. And just like a computer has an operating system, each of our brains has an operating system that's based on just repetitive behavior every day, in and out in terms of all of the experiences that we've had. And that operating system has created our mindsets, our belief systems, our capacity for decision making in one way or another, our ability to see opportunities or not, and all of those kind of things are just based on how our brains are wired. And I think one thing that, because neuroplasticity, in my opinion, is a bit of a buzzword, right? Because
Yes.
it sounds fancy.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's actually the opposite that a lot of people struggle with, was actually an inability for neuroplasticity, because the brain wants to hold on to these, kind of old long cables that it's created, these default neurological pathways, and they've become so strong and so comfortable for the brain that it takes the brain a tremendous amount of energy to be able to rewire itself. And that's something that a lot of people don't talk about. They think neuroplasticity happens automatically, and it doesn't. The brain doesn't like neuroplasticity. It doesn't like to
Prefers
change,
conformity, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that comes down to, the human brain, the commodity of the human brain is energy. And so it doesn't like to expend unnecessary energy. That makes it uncomfortable for the brain. So the brain's always going to try and make itself function within that neural pathway that's already been created and that's already been developed. So for most of us, creating an opportunity for neuroplasticity only happens if we're willing to make ourselves uncomfortable to be able to achieve that. And that's one of the greatest challenges of neuroplasticity, or, as we've noticed with COVID, if we have no other choice, right? So when we're thrown into a situation where it's like a sink or swim type thing, and the brain has no other choice, then it's going to go, okay, well, I guess I have to do something. And that's what triggers that ability for agility. And look at how much innovation happened in the world during COVID, right? Because everybody was forced to find other ways of functioning with their brains. Imagine if we could do that as a population voluntarily.
Correct.
Imagine what we could accomplish every year, in and out, as a whole, right? As a global population of human beings. If we could all do that every single day for the betterment of this planet, for the betterment of humanity, imagine what we could achieve. Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff, sure.
Correct. Just extending that a little bit more is to say, hey, our brain function, or our ability to react to stress or different situations, there's a lot of things that's happening within ourselves before an impulsive reaction happens. How should people try and build this? I would say, I don't know if there's an achievement of nirvana there, but at least some bit of better managing and bringing a little bit more harmony here. How should we develop that? Because I know it can be consciously developed.
Absolutely. And I'd like to kind of cite the cognitive behavioral therapy approach in this. I think I've found, working in this space with my clients has been the most helpful for them. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk about the kind of our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions as like a pyramid, or three sides of a triangle, and they all influence each other. And the unfortunate thing is that so many of us live applying really only one or two of them and not really applying all three simultaneously. So for example, there's a large population of people out there who just think and act, and who don't really take into consideration what they're feeling. And so their decisions tend to be very, what they then like to call strategic. It's just business is a great, comment that you hear from people who like to live in that think and act space. On the other hand, there's also a large group of people who feel and act. And those are the people who are kind of, reactive, as you just mentioned. Those are the people who, have an emotional impulse and just react right away, and sometimes in a little bit hyper reactive way, that can create all types of consequences. And I'm sure we're all, very familiar, and probably we've all experienced that in ourselves as well, right? And then there are also people who just think and feel. you know, and so they basically don't do anything. They just, you know, think and feel, and that wheel is just spinning around all day long about how they're thinking and feeling and lots of different thoughts and stories and all of that kind of stuff. And generally speaking, the way that we kind of create that most holistic piece is our ability to do all three at the same time, right? Is to be able to think, to be able to understand our feelings and the actions, and to really be able to create a dialogue around those three simultaneously. So I might be thinking something and then thinking about an action, but then my ability to take a step back from that and then to say, but what feelings are involved here? What are my emotions that are really driving me to want to, that are influencing my thought process here? What's going on, rather than me just think, oh, I'm making a really good decision. The same happens with my emotions. If I'm an emotional person and I have a tendency to react, is that ability to go, hey, wait, let's think about this for a minute. What's actually really happening? And then the final one, of course, is with the thinking and feeling space is kind of say, hey, what kind of actions could I take? What could I do to better my situation, to better, you know, what's available to me, right? You know, and I think that's an important kind of framework. And I love the framework because it's so simple in so many ways. And so simplicity is key, I always think, with regards to interventions. And so that helps people create a little bit of space. And I think that space between feeling and acting, or thinking and acting, or feeling and thinking, if we can create some space between that, that's where clarity comes in. And that's such an important space for them to be.
Wonderful, wonderful, Marcel. And how should leaders develop and tap their intuition better, Marcel? Because sometimes people know that there is an intuitive voice telling something to them, but they kind of disregard it and take some other direction, right? Because more of logic and facts available. So what are they missing out there? How should they kind of work with it together?
Well, and I'm gonna quote for a second time. I'm gonna quote Eckhart. Eckhart, I'm quoting you for a second time. Just want to throw that out in the universe. Is that the where wisdom lives, right? Is not in the mind. The wisdom lives in the body. And when it comes down to intuition, and it comes down to our ability to sense things, that is received by the body. So you got to think of the human body as a big antenna, and that projects energy out, but it also receives energy, and it receives impulses. And if you think about it this way, right, what's actually quite interesting, and when I was writing my book, I was thinking about that, is if you think about the head, right, the skull is like an exoskeleton that sits on top of it, and it won't let anything in, because it's this thick skull, it's this thick bone that won't let, you know, vibrations and all of that kind of stuff in. So our brain does not receive that kind of information very easily unless it comes into the top of the skull, which is, as we know from the chakras, is a place where you know, we can receive these type of, you know, information. But other than that, it's pretty much a, you know, it's going to be very dull type information that you hear through this big bone. But on the other hand, the body, right, the skeleton's on the inside, and you have all of this beautiful soft tissue, you know, that can receive vibrations and energy and all of that kind of stuff, and that comes into the body and then goes up through the base of the spine, up into the brain, enters the emotional centers of the brain first, right, where we can create these great feelings of like, oh, this feels right, and that feels, you know, maybe not so right. And so our ability to access intuition and our decision making is our ability to be able to kind of really receive these signals with the body, and you know, and play with our energy in that space to really be able to take that in. And that takes trust, right? Because, you know, people have a tendency to kind of just, you know, believe what's going on in their heads, and that's pretty much all they want to believe. And the moment we do that, we get stuck in our heads, and the more we get stuck in our heads, the less we can access that intuition. So for most people, they're only working on 30% capacity, because the feeling and that sensing space is just largely untapped. So imagine what kind of decisions we could be making if we really access that, right? And in saying that, I do have to make a little bit of a disclaimer, is that I also believe that most decision makers, most leaders are able to access their intuition. They are able to, because very often, you know, we see like spreadsheets and data points and all of that kind of stuff. And out of that comes this inspiration to be able to make a decision. And a large part of that is related to intuition, but that can just be enhanced more. That can be, you know, that can be really kind of seen as a really valuable tool to really be able to take that in and work with that, you know. So a lot more work can be done in that space, and that's, you know, at this point in time is still being ignored by a lot of people.
Absolutely, very beautifully said, Marcel. And I hope a lot of people can tap into it, and you know, they can enhance or multiply or amplify their impact, right, when they do these kinds of connections. Wonderful.
Yeah,
I have one final question for you, Marcel. It's about what is your own personal transformation story that other leaders
wow.
can learn from?
Wow. Do you have another hour and a half? It's, yeah. I think my biggest transformational story, and I wrote this, and you know, you can read my book, you know, the 5 energies of horrible bosses and how not to become one. But the largest transformation for me was when I was, there are actually 2 things. Number one is when I was a young child, I actually started studying martial arts. And so I'm a lifelong martial artist. I've been studying martial arts all my life. And so that was my kind of introduction to energy work and being aware of intuition and all of those kind of things. And the various different masters I've had in my life, and you know, have really contributed to that. But at the same time, when I was a young teenager, I was diagnosed with mental illness, and I was diagnosed with clinical depression and anxiety, severe anxiety, to a point where I was paralyzed, and that, as a young adult, got out of hand. I also became an alcoholic and a drug addict at a young age in my early 20s. So for in that period of time, I was very lost, as you can totally understand. And it was my work through mostly the energy work, more so than things like therapy and stuff like that, which I was also undergoing. But it was really that work through my martial arts, and I just had a great opportunity to work with a fantastic martial arts master who unfortunately passed away about 10 years ago. And he kind of helped me understand kind of my holistic way of being. I was so stuck in my own head in my anxiety and my mental illness. And when I started to pull that all together, you know, a world opened up for me, a world of possibility that you know, that kind of shaped me into who I am today. You know, so it doesn't mean I don't have flaws. I still have a ton of them, but I'm very comfortable living with them, and I can laugh about them now, and I can, you know, and I can manage myself, you know, in that space. That's something that I was not able to do. I was, you know, when I was in my 20s, I wasn't able to hold a job or anything like that because I was, you know, and of course I blamed myself because I thought I was dysfunctional. In today's society, luckily there's a lot more understanding for mental illness, but you know, back in my day, that wasn't the case. So we had to mask it, and you know, and not talk about it, and do all of those kind of things. So and I would say that that's my biggest transformation, is my ability to really kind of use that, my own understanding of energy, in that ability to become who I am today. And I wouldn't be the coach who I am today if I hadn't gone through that process myself.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks for sharing it. I mean, it's always
Sure.
the degree of vulnerability that we have to bring out, right, when you share these things. And thanks for taking the question head on.
Oh yeah, no worries. And you know what? One thing I've learned is we're all human, and there's no such thing as a perfect human being, and I'm not even going to begin to try. You know, and actually, I've learned to kind of celebrate my imperfections. And there's great beauty in that, and that's made life so much easier for me. So yeah, and I hope to embody that in a way that also inspires my clients to allow themselves to feel vulnerable, and you know, coaching sessions with me and things like that as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Good. I can see the sun streaming in your back end, and I'm the same here. And let's wrap up the evening and enjoy some good walk outside, perhaps.
Yes. Actually, I was thinking about that. Yeah, going for a walk tonight.
Yes, yes, yes. Wonderful, Marcel. I should say thank
No
you very
worries.
much. This has been a
Oh,
very
thank
interesting
you.
conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, my brain works in very different ways. So yeah, sometimes I have very different ideas about things. Yeah. So,
No, no,
but
no.
that's all part of being unique. Yeah,
Very
exactly. Well,
well.
thank you so much for taking me as well and having this time. And I look forward to doing this again.
Absolutely. Look forward to something when your next books comes out, Marcel.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Thank you, and all
Yeah.
the very best, and stay safe.
You too. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.